Trace many of psychology's current questions back through human history. These early thinkers wondered, how does our mind work? How does our body relate to our mind? How much of what we know comes built in? How much is acquired through experience? In India, Buddha pondered how sensations and perceptions combined to form ideas. In China, Confucius stressed the power of ideas and the educated mind. In ancient Israel, Hebrew scholars anticipated today's psychology by linking mind and emotion to the body. People were said to think that their heart and feel with their bowels. In ancient Greece, the philosopher teacher Socrates and his student Plato concluded that the mind is separable from body and continues after the body dies, and the knowledge that is innate, born with us. Unlike Socrates and Plato, who derived principles by logic, Plato's student Aristotle had a love of data. An intellectual ancestor of today's scientists, Aristotle derived principles from careful observations. Moreover, he said knowledge is not pre-existing. Sorry, Socrates and Plato. Instead, it grows from the experiences stored in our memories. The next 2,000 years brought few enduring new insights into human nature, but that changed in the 1600s when modern science began to flourish. With it came new theories of human behavior and new versions of ancient debates. A frail but brilliant Frenchman named René Descartes agreed with Socrates and Plato about the existence of the innate ideas in the mind being entirely distinct from the body and able to survive its death. Descartes' concept of the mind forced him to conjecture, as people have ever since, how the immaterial mind and physical body communicate. A scientist as well as a philosopher, Descartes dissected animals and concluded that the fluid in the brain cavities contained animal spirits. These spirits are surmised flowed from the brain through what we call the nerves, which he thought were hollow. The muscles provoking movement, memories formed as experiences, open pores in the brain, into which the animal spirits also flowed. Descartes was right that the nerve paths are important and they enable reflexes, yet genius though he was, and standing upon the knowledge accumulated from 99+% of our human history, he hardly had a clue of what today's average 12-year-old knows. Indeed, most of the scientific story of our self-exploration, the storybook told in his book, had been written in but the last historical blink of human time. Meanwhile, across the English Channel in Britain, science was taking a more down-to-earth form, centered on experiments, experience, and common-sense judgment. Francis Bacon became one of the founders in modern science, and his influence lingers in the experiments of today. Psychological science, Bacon was also fascinated by the human mind and its failings, anticipating what we have to appreciate about our mind's hunger to perceive patterns, even in random events. He wrote about the human understanding from its peculiar nature easily supposes a greater degree of order and equality in things than it finds. He also foresaw research findings on our noticing and remembering events that confirm our beliefs. All superstition is much the same, whenever it be of astrology, dreams, omens, and which of the deluded believers observe events which are fulfilled, but neglect and pass over their failure, though it must be more common. Some 50 years after Bacon's death, John Locke, a British political philosopher, sat down to write one-page essay on our own abilities for an upcoming discussion with friends. After 20 years and hundreds of pages, John Locke had completed one completed one of history's greatest late papers, an essay concerning human understanding, in which he famously argued that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, on which experience is written. This idea, adding to Bacon's ideas, helped form modern empiricism. The idea that what we know comes from experience, and the observation and experimentation enable scientific knowledge. Psychology, science is born. Philosophers thinking about thinking continued until the birth of psychology as we know it. On a September day in 1879, in a small third-floor room at Germany's University of Leipzig, there 2 young men were helping an austere, middle-aged professor, William Wundt, created an experimental apparatus. Their machine measured the time lag between people's hearing a ball hit a platform and they're pressing a telegraph key. Curiously, people who responded in about 1/10 of a second when asked to press the key as soon as they heard the sound occurred in about 2/10 of a second. When people asked to press the key as soon as they were consciously aware of perceiving the sound, to be aware of one's awareness takes a little longer. Wundt was seeking to measure atoms of the mind, the fastest and simplest mental process. So began the first psychological laboratory, staffed by Wundt and by psychology's first graduate students. In 1883, Wundt's American student G. Stanley Hall went on to establish the first formal U.S. psychology laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. Before long, this new science of psychology became organized into different branches or schools of thought, each promoted by pioneering thinkers. The early schools included structuralism, functionalism, and behaviorism, described here with more on behaviorism in modules 26 through 30, and 2 schools described in later modules: Gestalt Psychology, Module 19, and Psychoanalysis, Module 55. Thinking about the mind structure. Soon after receiving his Ph.D. in 1892, Wundt's student Edward Bradford Thacher joined the Cornell University facility and introduced structuralism. Structuralism was an early school of thought promoted by Wundt and Thacher, used the introspection to reveal the structure of the human mind. So it examined and studied how the human mind's emotional and mental process. As physicists and chemists discerned the structure of matter, so Thacher aimed to discover the structural elements of mind. His method was to engage people in self-reflective introspection, looking inward, training them to report elements of their experience as looked at a rose, listened to metronome, smelled a scent, or tasted a substance, what their immediate sensations were, their images, their feelings, and how did they relate to one another. The church shared with the English essayist C.S. Lewis the view that there is one thing, and the only one in the whole universe which we know more than we could learn from external observation. That one thing, Lewis said, is ourselves. We have to speak inside information. Alas, introspection required smart verbal people. It also proved somewhat unreliable, its results varying from person to person and experience to experience. Moreover, we often just don't know why we feel what we feel and do what we do. Recent studies indicate that people's recollections frequently err. So do their self-reports about what, for human example, has caused them to help or hurt another. And introspection waned, so did structuralism. Thinking about the mind's functions. Hoping to assemble the mind structure for simple elements was rather like trying to understand a car by examining its disconnected parts. Philosopher psychologist William James thought it would be more fruitful to consider the evolved functions of our thoughts and feelings, smelling what the nose does, thinking what the brain does. But why? Why do the nose and the brain do things? Under the influence of the evolutionary theorist Charles Darwin, James assumed that thinking, like smelling, developed because it was adaptive. It contributed to our ancestors' survival. Consciousness serves as a function. It enables us to consider our past, adjust our present, and plan our future. As a functionalist, functionalism is an early school of thought promoted by James and obviously influenced by Darwin, where they studied how the mental and behavioral process function for an organism to adapt, survive, and flourish. James encouraged explorations of down-to-earth emotions, memories, and willpower, habits, and moment-to-moment streams of consciousness. James' greatest legacy, however, came less from his laboratory and more from his Harvard teaching and his writing. When not plagued by ill health and depression, James was an impish, outgoing, joyous man who once recalled that the first lecture on psychology I ever heard was the first I ever gave. During his wisecracking lectures, a student interrupted him and asked him to get serious. He loved his students, his family, and the world of ideas, but he tired of paxting chores and proofreading. Send me no proofs, he told an editor. I will read them open and never speak to you again. James displayed the same spunk in 1890 when, over the objections of Harvard's president, he admitted Mary Whitcomb Calkins into his graduate seminar. When Calkins joined, the other students dropped out, so James tutored her alone. Later, she finished all the requirements for Harvard PhD, outsourcing all the male students on the qualifying exams. Alas, Harvard denied her the degree she had earned, offering her instead a degree from Radcliffe College. It's an undergraduate sister school for women. Calkins resided in unequal treatment and refused the degree. Later, psychologists and psychology students were lobbying Harvard to posthumously award Calkins the PhD she earned. Calkins nevertheless went on to become distinguished memory researcher for the APA's first female president in 1905. When Harvard denied Calkins the claim to being psychology's first female psychology PhD, the honor fell to Margaret Floyd Washburn, who later wrote an influential book, The Animal Mind, and became the second female APA president in 1921. Although Washburn's thesis was the first foreign study published in his journal, Her gender meant she was barred from joining the organization of experimental psychologists who explored the behavior and thinking of experiments. Despite its being founded by Thatcher, her own graduate advisor, Johnson. What a different world from recent past, 1996 to 2013, when women claimed 2/3 or more of new U.S. psychology PhDs and were 9 of the 18 elected presidents of Science-Oriented Association for Psychological Science. In Canada and Europe, two most recent psychology doctorates have been earned by women. James' influence reached even further through his dozens of well-received articles, which moved the publisher Henry Holt to offer contract for a textbook for the new science of psychology. James agreed and began work in 1878, an apology for requesting 2 years to finishing his writing. The text proved an unexpected chore and actually took him 12 years. Why am I not surprised? More than a century later, people still read the resulting principles of psychology and marvel at the brilliance and elegance with which James introduced the psychology to educate the public. Psychological science develops. In psychology's early days, Wundt and Thatcher focused on inner sensations, images, and feelings. James, too, engaged in an introspective examination of stream consciousness and emotion. Sigmund Freud emphasized the ways emotional responses to childhood experiences and our unconscious thought process affected our behavior. Thus, until the 1920s, psychology was defined as the science of mental life. And so it continued until the 1920s, when the first two larger-than-life American psychologists appeared on the scene. Flamboyant and procrafted John B. Watson, and later the equal procrafted B.F. Skinner, dismissed the introspective and redefined psychology as the scientific study of observable behavior. After all, they say science is rooted in observation. You cannot observe a sensation, a feeling, or a thought, but you can observe and record people's behavior as they respond to different situations. They further suggest that our behavior is influenced by learned associations through a process called conditioning. Many agreed in the behaviors were one of two major forces in psychology well into the 1960s. The other major force was Freudian psychology, which emphasized the ways in our unconscious thought process and our emotional responses to childhood experiences affected our behavior. As behaviorists had done in the early 1900s, two other groups rejected the definition of psychology that was current in the 1960s. The first humanistic psychologists, led by Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, found both Freudian psychology and behavioralism too limiting, rather than focusing on the meaning of early childhood memories or learning of conditioned responses. A humanistic psychologist drew attention to ways of the current environmental influences that can nature or limit our growth potential and importance of having our needs for loved and acceptance satisfied. The rebellion of a second group of psychologists during the 1960s is now known as the Conjunctive Revolution. It led the field back to its earliest interest in mental processes, such as the importance of how our mind processes and retains information. Cognitive psychology scientifically explores the way we perceive, process, and remember information. Cognitive neuroscience, an interdisciplinary study that has enriched our understanding of the brain activity underlying mental activity. The cognitive approach has given us new ways to understand ourselves and to treat disorders such as depression. To encompass psychology concerned with observable behavior and other inner thoughts and feelings, today we define psychology as the science of behavior and mental process. Let's unpack this definition. Behavior is anything an organism does. Any action we do, observe, and record. Yelling, smiling, blinking, sweating, talking, and questionnaire marking are all observable behaviors. Mental processes are the internal subjective experiences we interfere from behaviors, sensations, perceptions, dreams, thoughts, beliefs, and feelings. The key word in psychology's definition is science. Psychology, as I will emphasize throughout this book, is less a set of findings than a way of asking and answering questions. My aim, then, is not merely to report results, but to also show you how psychologists play their game. You'll see how researchers evaluate conflicting opinions and ideas. And you will learn how all of us, whether scientists or simply curious people, can think smarter when describing and explaining the events of our lives.